Hello, this is again Dr. Jonathan Bentovich, and I'm continuing to present certain topics from God's Physics new book of mine that was published in the US and in the world by iUniverse.com. And what I want to speak about today is a very exciting topic which has to do with the complete unification not only of space-time, energy, and mass, as I've written in the book, and as I've presented in the presentations in these lectures, but also even beyond that, that this new God's physics paradigm allows for a complete unification of the physical and biological evolution, so to speak. So what I want to begin talking about today is, first of all, to review for those readers and viewers. And by the way, I've written the God's Physics book. I say this again and again because it's important. I've written it for the general public, for the layman reader, because I strongly believe that this revolution that's taking place in 21st century theoretical physics is not just intended for physicists and scientists. No doubt it does revolutionize and change in a very basic and profound way science, and it advances science's understanding of the universe in a very significant way. But beyond that, this new knowledge that's coming to the world with this new God's physics paradigm of 21st century physics, this new knowledge that's coming to the world is intended, I would almost say, primarily for the whole of humanity. And as I'll explain today, since there is an ultimate goal behind the evolution of the universe by this higher universal conscious reality, and that ultimate goal is the state of perfection, of moral and spiritual perfection, which is called in Jewish tradition Geula. Since that's the aim towards which the universe is evolving, the knowledge of that state, which comes now through science, through God's physics new paradigm, is essential for the development and evolution of the whole of humanity. And as part of this whole scheme, this whole grand evolution of the whole universe. But let's begin first with, again, highlighting why this paradigmatic shift, this revolution in science is so essential, and what does it mean? So I begin again just by reviewing and explaining to the general public that science is, as Thomas Kuhn, the known philosopher of science, analyzed the evolution of science, and he explained that science is a human endeavor. And as a human endeavor, it has its flaws and weaknesses and its strengths, obviously. And he pointed out that science evolves through a series of revolutions, so to speak. And he explained that in initial phase, or for a certain while, science is based on a certain assumption or assumptions. That's a given paradigm. So if we take the example of Newtonian mechanics, 19th century Newtonian mechanics, classical mechanics, that was a certain way of looking at the world. And that way of looking at the world and analyzing the world was sufficient for a certain while. When science reached a point where it can look at and even measure and analyze higher speeds, relativistic speeds, speeds approaching the speed of light, then Einstein came along and showed that the Newtonian mechanical way of looking at the world is okay, but it's a little bit restricted, and it's a special case within a broader understanding. And so relativity theory essentially became the broader understanding, such as a house within which a certain room exists. That room, that small room, was Newtonian mechanics, and the house would be relativity theory. And even beyond that house, relativity theory, now we need to look at the neighborhood and the country, etc. And so Thomas Kuhn taught us that science has to evolve. It cannot remain static, and it has to evolve, and it evolves by expanding more and more its gaze about the world and understanding of the universe. So today, and also Thomas Kuhn showed the world that science, when it does have to expand its gaze, so to speak, from a room to a house to a neighborhood, etc., that phase is a little bit difficult for scientists more than for science, because scientists are human beings, and human beings, as human beings, have their flaws and weaknesses. And one of those weaknesses is that we as human beings find it difficult to get out of our comfort zone, so to speak, and go and venture into the unknown. I give an example, by the way, in the book about Christopher Columbus, and a historic example. Christopher Columbus obviously discovered America, Northern America, and at that time, the conception, the knowledge of humanity at that time, or in Europe at least, was that the world is constrained to a certain environment, and there was even a thought that if a person would wander beyond a certain point, the world is flat, and then, therefore the person, or the ship rather, would fall off the cliff of the world. It sounds amazing in our mind, but that was the knowledge at that time. And so people were not encouraging Christopher Columbus to venture out. He was very bold, and like Einstein, he wanted to know what's out there. And Einstein also ventured beyond the norms and the limited knowledge of Newtonian mechanics. So Thomas Kuhn is telling us that when we reach that point of a paradigmatic shift in science, we need to expand our minds. And that phase of paradigmatic shift, first of all, is characterized by the fact that we have contradictions, apparent contradictions between the old pillars of the old paradigm. In the case of Newtonian mechanics, it was between Newtonian mechanics and Maxwell's electromagnetic theory. And so first we have contradictions, apparent contradictions between the pillars of the old paradigm. Second of all, we have certain phenomena or phenomenon that cannot be explained by the old paradigm. So, for example, in the case of Einstein, the ether concept was assumed to be a substance, a fine substance, perfusing and filling the whole universe. And scientists tried to find that ether concept and were not able to do so. And Einstein, in his genius and open-mindedness, said, well, if we cannot find it, we have to discard it. And then he set a few postulates, new postulates of relativity theory, and was able to expand our gaze, expand our knowledge of the universe. And that's what's happening today. So the old paradigm of 20th century physics, which is relativity theory and quantum mechanics, that old paradigm has reached that dead-end state that Kuhn described, that dead-end state which calls for a paradigmatic shift. And we know that because we see the same symptoms. The two pillars of the old paradigm, which is relativity theory about the macroscopic universe, quantum mechanics about the microscopic world, those seem to collide. They contradict each other, or seem to contradict each other. And then there is a major phenomenon, just as the ether concept, which is purely hypothetical. Scientists tried to find it and were not able to detect it, and science had to discard it. In the same way, today, one of the 50 plus articles that I've written and were published in major international journal of physics, and I presented this also as the opening keynote lectures in multiple physics conferences. So one of those articles spoke about the fact that dark matter and dark energy are superfluous, just as Einstein said that the ether is superfluous. So the thing is that the old paradigm, the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics is negated and is insufficient. And the new paradigm, which is God's physics paradigm, I called it earlier the computational unified field theory, in recognition of Einstein's visionary quest for a unifying field theory that would unify relativity theory and quantum mechanics. So the new God's physics paradigm essentially is able to bridge the gap and unite relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and is also able to explain that unexplained phenomena of the accelerated expansion of the universe, that the universe is being expanded quicker and quicker. Galaxies seem to parse out and get more distant from each other at a quicker and quicker rate, and that cannot be explained by physicists today or by the old paradigm of relativity theory. So actually we're missing about 95% of all mass and energy in the universe, and the old model is assuming, again purely hypothetical, that those missing 95% of mass and energy are really dark matter, dark energy, but that doesn't make sense because it cannot be detected. And again, we have to adopt Einstein's bold, open-minded, genius thinking and say, as God's physics paradigm is saying, well, if we cannot detect it, let's discard it. Let's build a new model, a more expansive model that includes the old relativistic and quantum mechanical models as special cases, just as Einstein foresaw and was looking for such unifying field theory. Okay, so we understand now that science is transitioning now into this new God's physics paradigm. And this new God's physics paradigm is essentially telling us that the major discovery of this new God's physics paradigm is really the fact that there is the discovery of a new, singular, higher ordered universal computational principle, UCP, or universal consciousness, universal computational or universal consciousness principle or reality. That universal consciousness reality, which I'll explain why it's called reality, but that universal consciousness reality or principle is computing the whole universe many times, many billions of times per second. It's actually creating the universe, dissolving the universe, recreating the universe in an expanded format and dissolving it, and then recreating it more expanded. So this is happening many billions of times per second. By the way, on the cover of the God's Physics book at the bottom, there is this universal computational formula, which essentially integrates the four basic physical features of space-time, energy, and mass for the first time in science. I spoke about it in one of the previous lectures. Unifies between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and points at how this universal consciousness principle, which I presented by the Hebrew letter Yud, that Yud is that small white dot with a point on the upper corner, and at the bottom corner, that's the smallest letter of the Jewish alphabet. So that Yud, and that appears on the illustration, beautiful illustration by the artist, the well-known artist Nachshon of Kiryat Arba in Israel. So anyway, that Yud, which is representing the universal consciousness principle, that Yud is shown in the universal computational formula, how this Yud is creating and integrating space-time, energy, and mass many billions of times per second, and creating in each billionth of a billionth, etc. Per second minimal time point. It's how this Yud, this universal consciousness reality, is creating the whole universe as a picture, as a universal frame, and then that frame dissolves back into this universal consciousness principle, UCP. And again, this is happening many billions of times per second, which is amazing. So the new God's physics paradigm shows us that really the whole universe is not static. The universe is evolving. It's actually a process of creation, a continuous process of creation by this universal conscious reality. That's the major discovery of God's physics. It includes relativity theory and quantum mechanics as special cases, but it's a much broader understanding. Excuse me. So, what we're realizing now is that the new God's physics paradigm is essentially taking science a step forward. And the topic of today's presentation is, in what manner does this new God's physics paradigm of 21st century physics, in what manner does this new paradigm allow science to unify more and more of the elements of nature together. Um, um, Specifically, what we're speaking about today is how this new God's physics paradigm unifies between what was seen as separate between physical evolution and biological evolution. In order to explain that, we need to take one step back and look at, again, what's the major flaw, so to speak, the major limitation or constraint of the old material causal paradigm. The old material causal paradigm of relativity theory about the macroscopic universe and quantum mechanics, the microscopic universe, the old material causal paradigm had a limitation. And that limitation was that essentially it's a material causal paradigm. What does that mean? In simple terms, it means that the old way of relativity theory and quantum mechanics of looking at the world, analyzing the universe, is the assumption that everything in the universe happens or can be explained by cause and effect between material entities or interactions. For example, general relativity theory tells us that the universe was created by an initial Big Bang nuclear event. That's just and that the universe evolves by interaction between massive objects and space-time. That massive objects curve the fabric of space around them, which is space-time. Take the Big Bang model, which again was negated and challenged by the new God's physics paradigm, and there is articles and keynote lectures that I presented which negate the Big Bang model based on this new God's physics paradigm. So why is it negated? Because and in what way does this Big Bang model show us the old assumption of material causality? So what is the Big Bang? The Big Bang is an assumption, or it is derived from this material causal assumption that the whole mass and energy of the universe was condensed within a very small region of space. That condensed matter underwent a nuclear explosion, nuclear event, which created mass, energy, space, and time, created suns, galaxies, planets, etc. And that nuclear explosion or event then erupted and caused the universe to expand itself. And as an additional assumption with what I mentioned earlier, the dark matter, dark energy, which is completely hypothetical, cannot be observed, that's assumed also by general relativity theory to be the engine, so to speak, that pushes the galaxies apart from each other. So what's the flaw of that, or what's the innovation of the new God's physics paradigm? First of all, we saw that the old paradigm doesn't work because it cannot explain where 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe exists. So it just doesn't work, and we need to expand to the new God's physics paradigm. So what's the innovation of the new God's physics paradigm? The innovation is understanding that because this universal computational or consciousness principle, UCP, is computing simultaneously all of the points in the universe, every time that it creates a frame, it's creating simultaneously all the points in that frame. So for each frame, the whole frame is presented at the same time, simultaneously. So because the UCP, the Universal Consciousness Principle, is creating the whole universe simultaneously, each frame at the same time, all the pixels, all the atoms, all the planets, all the galaxies are presented at the same time for each consecutive frame of the universe. Therefore, there cannot be any interaction within the frame. And again, I give the example that if we had the glass cup and the hammer is hitting the glass cup, and that glass cup in the film, we see that glass cup is being shattered and the juice is being spilled, and somebody's asking us, okay, what's causing the breakage of the glass cup? We would say, well, it's the hammer. We see the hammer hitting the glass cup, and then the glass cup being shattered and the liquid, the juice, being spilled. But when we slow down the progression of the film, we see it's an analogy for what we see about the universal computational or consciousness principle, how it's evolving the universe. So we see it each frame that they're presented at the same time. The first frame they're presented at a certain distance, then at a closer distance, etc., etc. But even when they touch each other, they're still being presented in the same frame at the same time. So there cannot be any interaction between them. That metaphor tells us that what seems to be as causality is not really causality. It's just the arrangement of the frames of the film in the metaphor, and in the real world, in the God's physics new paradigm, the arrangement of the universal frames in a certain order and sequence by the universal consciousness reality is giving us the impression that the universe the universe is evolving, and that as if there exists material interactions. So the Big Bang, for example, we assumed in the old model that we had an eruption and then creation of space-time, energy, mass, galaxies, expansion. But that cannot be the case, because even in the first initial frame, and even if there was a nuclear event, that nuclear event was not really creating space and time. There could not have been an interaction. Rather, the universal conscious reality was presenting a universe in an initial phase, then presenting it in a more expansive form, and it's continuing to evolve the frames. But each frame is created afresh. It's not the result of the old frame. All the universe is dissolving between frames, so there cannot be a Big Bang nuclear event. There's no transmission of any matter in space from the first frame to the second frame. There's no real expansion, because there's no interaction either within any given frame or between frames, right? So the new God's physics paradigm is negating causality and material causality as we know it. And so the Big Bang model could not exist. The expansion of the universe as a result of dark matter, dark energy, which cannot be detected, cannot exist, because there is no possibility of an interaction between dark matter, dark energy, and the rest of the universe. There's no transmission of any matter and physical force from one frame to the second frame. So we are led to the realization. It's quite mind-boggling, and it's expanding our consciousness, which is part of the reason that this new knowledge is coming to the world, to allow humanity to expand its understanding towards this Geula, perfected state. But in any event, we have to expand our consciousness. We have to start realizing, as God's physics paradigm is showing us, that there's no cause and effect. That really there's no material interaction between massive objects and space-time, curving space-time. There's no initial nuclear Big Bang model. What really exists is this universal consciousness reality. It's creating the universe and dissolving the universe. Every time it creates a new frame of the universe, that new frame is expanded by the universal consciousness reality. What's expanding the universe, what's evolving the universe, is only the operation of the universal consciousness reality. It's quite amazing realization. So where does this lead us? First of all, the whole of science has to be revolutionized across the board, because that material causal basic assumption underlies physics, biology, chemistry, all the sciences. Psychology, psychiatry, all the sciences. Darwin's natural selection principle is negated by this new God's physics paradigm, in the same way that the Big Bang model is negated by this new God's physics paradigm. And you know what, let me say a word, as I said in one of the articles, 9 articles in this new God's physics paradigm, new God's physics book, published by iuniverse.com, which I very much recommend the general public to read. So I point out that Darwin's natural selection principle is also negated. Why? Because Darwin's natural selection principle is essentially telling us, assuming, again, material causality, that the way that the species, the various forms of life evolved on the planet is by 2 material causal assumptions. One is that those organisms that were able to survive certain environmental conditions. Darwin gave the example of an iguana, a reptile living in a certain island, and there's different islands there. And one of the islands, for example, has, or there's a certain situation where there's famine, and an iguana, a specific iguana individual or organism that has, by genetic mutations, that's another material interaction or causal assumption, that the cosmic rays that are hitting our planet cause genetic mutations, chance genetic mutations, genetic changes in the genetic code, and that chance mutations, because of the cosmic rays, that causes a change in the genes, and in one case, one of the iguanas has developed a longer neck, and that longer neck allowed that specific iguana to reach higher leaves in a state of famine and survive. And those other iguanas, which did not, by chance mutation, that was the assumption, develop that longer neck, died. And therefore, that iguana with a longer neck would then reproduce and allow offsprings of a new longer neck species to evolve. And by that material interaction of interactions between cosmic rays and genetic material that changes the genetic material, and then the changed genetic material of a specific organism allows that organism to survive better. Again, material causality, because that organism and its interaction with the environment has better chances, so to speak, or assumed, than a shorter neck organism that would die and be extinct. But this is material causality, whether we're speaking about the interaction between cosmic rays and genetic material, and whether we speak about certain organisms being able to survive in harsh environmental situations or conditions and others do not survive. That's all material interaction between the organism and the environment, or between genetic information or code and cosmic rays. But think about it, because according to the new God's physics paradigm, there cannot be any interaction really, either within any given frame or transference of any material information, such as genetic information, or specifically one from one frame to another frame. So Darwin's natural selection principle is negated. There's no cause and effect in the regular way that we think of. So what does exist? And that's the topic of today's lecture. What does exist is the universal conscious reality is creating a series of frames, and that series of frames allows the universe to evolve more and more. And now we have to then realize what's the plan, what's the characteristics of this higher ordered singular universal conscious reality. In a sense, we're transitioning from the old material causal paradigm that looked at the world just as interactions between different material entities into a completely new understanding that the universe doesn't exist and doesn't evolve by itself. It's completely dependent. It's being produced, reproduced, dissolved, and evolved so many billions of times per second by this universal conscious reality. And perhaps I'll mention another element, another postulate that I mentioned in the previous lectures, which is key, and again it's appearing in the God's Physics book by iuniverse.com. That postulate I call the computational invariance principle. And that computational invariance principle essentially tells us that because only the universal consciousness principle, the UCP, exists both in between the frames and producing and computing the whole universe during each frame, the only thing that really exists is this universal consciousness principle. That's the only thing that really exists. The other elements, which are space-time, energy, and mass, that comprise all the atoms, all the galaxies, everything that's physical in the universe, space-time, energy, and mass that comprise the whole universe, and the whole universe itself only exists during the frames, but dissolves back into the universal consciousness principle in between the frames. So therefore, the only thing that really exists continuously and consistently is this universal consciousness principle or reality. And what that means is that the universe is really just a manifestation of this universal conscious reality. I mentioned earlier that I call this universal consciousness reality because the only thing that exists all the time is this universal conscious reality, and the world, the universe, is a manifestation, a temporary manifestation, temporary and evolving manifestation of this universal conscious reality. So the universal conscious reality is the only reality that exists all the time. It's permanent and it's real. The other things about the universe are only manifestation of this universal conscious reality. And in a sense, the evolution of the universe towards that Geula state is humanity and science starting to realize that there's only one universal conscious reality, and what's its characteristics, which is moral, which is harmony and peace. And that compels humanity to live accordingly. So that creates the Geula state. But just to make it clear and complete our understanding, so this new God's physics paradigm is leading us from the old material causal paradigm, assuming that the world was created by a random nuclear event, a Big Bang event, nuclear event, that the evolution of the species, whether it's plants, animals, human beings, etc., all evolved by what Darwin assumed to be a natural selection principle, all chance interactions, either genetic mutations and accompanied by interactions between organisms and a challenging environment. And that old paradigm is negated. So also the species did not evolve by chance interactions. There cannot be any interactions, chance or otherwise. So now we're getting into the understanding of what this universal conscious reality, singular, higher order universal conscious reality, what's its plan for evolving the universe. And we see it's amazing. It's an awe-striking realization of science. And I wrote about it in one of the 9 articles in the God's Physics book, that the whole evolution of the universe, not just the physical, but the physical, the biological, the psychological, all of these things are integrated because they're all dependent on that higher force, that higher universal conscious reality, or God in religious terms. It's the same thing. So we start realizing that the universal conscious reality is evolving the universe from really inanimate matter, so that's atoms and planets, galaxies, etc. It's evolving the universe from inanimate matter through animate forms of life that would be plants, and then animals, and then human beings. There is an expansion of the consciousness. The universal conscious reality is manifesting in a more and more progressively more expansive form, because plants possess a much more limited form of consciousness. They can grow, they can sense the environment, heat, light, but not much beyond it. Animals have a broader manifestation of consciousness. They can feel, they can move, they have certain elements of choice, not real choice, but instinctive actions, but still they can choose certain things, so the consciousness is expanding. Human beings obviously are much more expansive in their consciousness. We're aware of our existence. We can think, we can ask questions, we can wonder about the universe, etc. And then, so there is an evolution by the universal conscious reality from a more restrictive to a more expansive form of consciousness, which is from inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings, and then human beings towards the perfected Geula state, the perfected ultimate goal of this universal conscious reality, which is within humanity. When humanity reaches that perfected, expanded consciousness, which means that humanity now realizes that the whole universe really is only a manifestation of that singular, higher ordered universal conscious reality. And science is starting to investigate what's the characteristics of this universal conscious reality. And we start discovering that the characteristics of this singular universal conscious reality is all goodness. It's moral. The moral principle is essential. Is key within the operation of this universal conscious reality. I spoke about it, and I'll elaborate in one of the next presentations, that the moral principle is telling us that our choices matter a lot. That when an individual human consciousness makes a good moral choice, or God forbid, a negative moral choice, inflicting pain on another individual, God forbid, then that choice creates one or instigates the universal conscious reality to select one of multiple possible futures for that individual. If that individual acted in a moral way and helped a poor person by giving him tzedakah, giving him money and charity, then that means that individual that gave from himself to that other poor person would also be given in an equivalent manner, even much greater than that. And vice versa, if a person inflicted pain or suffering on another individual, God forbid, then that individual which inflicted the pain would have to experience something equivalent in order to awaken and expand that individual's consciousness to understand that we're all integrated. I give the example in the book. It appears also in Jewish tradition, Hasidic tradition, that a normal person, a healthy individual, mentally healthy individual, would never use the right hand to inflict pain on the left hand, because we realize it's us, it's the same body. In the same way, the universal conscious reality is teaching humanity the moral principle that we cannot inflict pain on each other. As a matter of fact, we have to help each other. The right hand would put a bandage on the left hand if it was a cut, etc. So we start realizing that this universal conscious reality is bringing the universe towards the whole scheme, the whole plan of the creation and evolution of the universe is to bring the universe into a perfected moral spiritual state. And that perfected moral spiritual state is a state in which humanity, science, realizes that there is only one force, one universal conscious reality that's creating, sustaining, and evolving the universe. And more so, that universal conscious reality is evolving the universe towards a moral and spiritual perfected state in which humanity, by realizing that oneness, realizing the morality, the moral principle characterizing and guiding this universal conscious reality, the humanity would reach a state of perfection, which is, I call it Geula. That's the way it's termed in Jewish tradition. But in any event, that's a moral, spiritual, and even physical perfected state. That perfected state is a state of peace and harmony, a state of reverence towards that universal conscious reality or God. So we're reaching the end of this presentation. It's a real eye-opener, because we start realizing that everything is integrated. The universe was not created by a random nuclear event, a Big Bang. The species and human beings were not created just by chance genetic mutations and chance interactions between organisms and the environment. The universe is operating and was created and is sustained and is evolving really towards a perfected state, and therefore the evolution of the universe is one. The physical evolution from inanimate, animate, plants, animals, human beings, that integrates that scheme of evolving the universe from the beginning. Actually, the universal conscious reality has created the universe from the beginning in the light of or towards the ultimate goal. There is actually a hypothesis that I discovered in the God's physics paradigm, which I call it the reverse time goal hypothesis, which says that the universal conscious reality has created the universe in a sense from the end to the beginning, from the ultimate goal which it wants the universe to evolve towards. That ultimate goal is the origin in thought, in purpose of the universal conscious reality, and it's evolving then the whole universe towards that goal. So what does that mean? It teaches us human beings that our actions matter, that we have to choose morally, that we have to start awakening and realizing that every other individual human being is part of the same one higher all goodness, moral universal conscious reality or God, that we're all part of this reality, that reality cares very much about our moral actions and choices, and cares about humanity reaching that perfected Geula state, which is what science is discovering right now. So it's a real pleasure to elaborate these fascinating discoveries of the new God's physics paradigm, published by iuniverse.com. I encourage everybody to read that, and I think it's very important, and it's enlightening, not just science, but humanity and each one of us individually. Thank you very much.